What would you do if you were surrounded by dozens of enemy soldiers, your rifle empty, your pistol jammed, and the closest help was more than 15 miles away through jungle so thick that sunlight never touched the ground? Would you pray? Would you surrender? Would you close your eyes and wait for the end? Or would you reach into the blood of your ancestors and become something that your enemies had never seen before? Something they could not understand, something that would haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from, what state, what country. I want to know where all of you are. And if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that button. This channel survives because of people like you who help spread these stories that the history books tried to bury. These are the accounts they did not want you to know. So subscribe, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and let us dive into one of the most extraordinary stories of courage ever recorded in American military history. The date was February 19th, 1968. The place was a narrow valley in the central highlands of Vietnam, approximately 12 kilometers southwest of Dak To in Con Tum province. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the smell of rotting vegetation, cordite, and something else that the soldiers would later describe as the scent of approaching death. Private First Class. Mary Louise Begay, serial number 547892231, was 23 years old. Born on the Navajo reservation near Shiprock, New Mexico, the daughter of a medicine man named Hostine Begay and a weaver named Annie Tso Begay. She had enlisted in the United States Army in 1966, one of the first Native American women to volunteer for combat support duties in Southeast Asia. The recruiters in Farmington had laughed when she walked through their door. They stopped laughing when they saw her shoot. Mary Louise had grown up hunting with her brothers across the mesas and canyons of the Four Corners region. By the time she was 12, she could drop a jackrabbit at 200 yards with an old Winchester that had belonged to her grandfather. By 16, she was providing meat for 3 neighboring families whose men had gone to work in the uranium mines. The Army recognized her gift immediately. She was assigned to the 45th Medical Battalion as a combat medic. But her marksmanship scores were so exceptional that she was frequently attached to infantry patrols as a designated marksman, a role that officially did not exist for women at that time. The paperwork listed her as a medical specialist. The soldiers who served with her called her something else entirely. They called her Ghost Walker. The patrol that morning consisted of 14 soldiers from Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 173rd Airborne Brigade. They had been inserted by helicopter at 0530 hours, with orders to locate and assess enemy activity along a suspected supply route that intelligence believed was being used to funnel weapons and reinforcements toward the besieged Marine base at Khe Sanh. The mission was classified as reconnaissance only. No contact was expected. Intelligence was wrong. Sergeant First Class William R. Thornton, a 31-year-old career soldier from Macon, Georgia, was leading the patrol. He had served 2 previous tours in Vietnam and had developed an almost supernatural sense for danger. That morning, as the patrol moved through a bamboo grove, approximately 2 kilometers from their insertion point, Thornton felt the hair on the back of his neck stand up. He raised his fist, signaling the patrol to halt. For a long moment, nothing happened. The jungle was silent, too silent. Even the insects had stopped their endless chorus. Then the world exploded. The ambush was devastating in its precision. The North Vietnamese army had positioned at least 3 platoons along both ridgelines, overlooking the valley floor, creating a kill zone approximately 100 meters long and 50 meters wide. The first volley of fire killed 4 Americans instantly. Specialist 4th Class Robert Chen, a radio operator from San Francisco, was hit in the throat before he could transmit a distress call. Private First Class James Whitehorse, a Lakota from Pine Ridge, who had become Mary Louise's closest friend in the unit, took 2 rounds to the chest, and collapsed without a sound. Sergeant Thornton was wounded in the left shoulder, but managed to pull 3 soldiers behind a fallen mahogany tree that provided temporary cover. Mary Louise was near the rear of the patrol when the firing started. Her first instinct was not to hide, but to move. She had learned this from her father, who had taught her that stillness was death when the coyote had you in its sights. You had to become wind. You had to become shadow. She dropped to the jungle floor and crawled through the undergrowth, her M16 rifle cradled in her arms, moving toward the sound of screaming. She found Private First Class Anthony Morales from El Paso, Texas, lying in a pool of his own blood with a bullet wound in his right thigh. The femoral artery had been nicked, but not severed. He had perhaps 4 minutes before blood loss rendered him unconscious, and perhaps 7 minutes before death. Mary Louise had her aid bag open before she fully stopped moving. Her hands worked with mechanical precision, applying a tourniquet, packing the wound with hemostatic gauze, injecting morphine from a syringe. Morales was whimpering, calling for his mother. Mary Louise spoke to him in Navajo, a language he could not understand, but somehow the ancient words calmed him. She told him about the mountains of her home, about the way the light turned golden before sunset, about the sheep her grandmother tended on the slopes above Chinle. Morales stopped shaking. The enemy fire was intensifying. Mary Louise could hear the distinctive crack of AK-47 rifles, the deeper boom of rocket-propelled grenades, the screams of wounded men from both sides. She needed to move Morales to better cover, but any movement would expose them to the soldiers on the ridgeline. She looked up at the canopy, calculating angles, distances, probabilities, and then she saw something that made her blood freeze. Approximately 40 meters to her left, emerging from the dense vegetation like phantoms, a squad of North Vietnamese soldiers was advancing on Sergeant Thornton's position from the flank. They had not yet been spotted. They were moving in absolute silence, their camouflage so effective that they seemed to materialize from the jungle itself. There were 8 of them, and they would reach Thornton and the survivors in less than 90 seconds. Mary Louise did not have time to shout a warning. By the time her voice reached them, the enemy soldiers would already be throwing grenades. She raised her M16 and opened fire. Her first 3-round burst caught the lead soldier in the center of his chest, dropping him instantly. Her second burst struck the man behind him in the head. The remaining 6 soldiers scattered, diving for cover, their flanking maneuver disrupted. Mary Louise had bought Thornton's group perhaps 30 seconds. It was enough. The sergeant had heard her firing and turned to see the threat. His own weapon barked, and another enemy soldier fell. The flanking attack had been blunted, but now Mary Louise had revealed her position. The volume of fire directed at her was staggering. She rolled behind a termite mound approximately 3 feet high and pressed herself into the earth as bullets struck all around her, showering her with dirt and fragments of hardened clay. Her ears were ringing. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her teeth. She returned fire in controlled bursts, conserving ammunition, but she knew the math was against her. She had started the patrol with 7 magazines, 210 rounds. She had already expended 2 magazines in the initial exchange. At this rate of fire, she would be empty in less than 3 minutes. The enemy commander, a captain named Nguyen Van Thao, who had been fighting Americans since Ia Drang in 1965, recognized what was happening. He had lost 5 men to a single American soldier who was now pinned down and alone. He ordered a squad to fix her in position with suppressive fire while a second squad maneuvered to encircle her. He wanted her taken alive if possible. A woman fighting with the American infantry was unusual. Intelligence would want to interrogate her. Mary Louise saw the encirclement developing. She was down to her last magazine, 20 rounds. There were at least 20 enemy soldiers within 100 meters of her position, and more were arriving every minute. She had no radio, no support, no hope of extraction. The logical thing to do was to put her hands up and pray for merciful captors, But Mary Louise Begay had never been logical. She was Navajo. Her people had fought the Spanish, the Mexicans, the Americans themselves. They had survived the long walk, the concentration camps, the systematic destruction of their culture. Surrender was not in her vocabulary. She reached into the cargo pocket of her fatigue trousers and withdrew a leather roll approximately 8 inches long. Inside were 3 objects that she had carried with her since the day she left the reservation. They were not standard military issue. They were not even legal for soldiers to carry. They were the knives of her ancestors, hand-forged steel blades that her grandfather had made from the leaf springs of a Model T Ford in 1928. Balanced for throwing with the precise understanding of physics that the Navajo had developed over centuries of hunting. Her grandfather had taught her to throw them before she learned to ride a bicycle. Her father had refined her technique until she could split a playing card at 20 paces. She had never told anyone in the army about them. Some things were too sacred to share. The first North Vietnamese soldier who entered her field of vision was a young man, perhaps 19 years old, with the lean build of someone who'd been fighting in the jungle for years. He was moving carefully, his AK-47 raised to his shoulder, his eyes scanning the undergrowth for any sign of movement. He never saw the knife that killed him. It entered his throat just below the Adam's apple and severed his carotid artery with surgical precision. He died without making a sound. His companion, an older soldier with the stripes of a sergeant on his sleeve, turned at the subtle noise of the body falling. He saw his comrade lying in the mud with a strange metal object protruding from his neck. He opened his mouth to shout a warning. The second knife struck him in the right eye and penetrated his brain. He was dead before his body hit the ground. Mary Louise was moving now, flowing through the jungle like water, like smoke. Like the spirits that her grandmother had told her about in stories around the fire. She had one knife left. She would need to retrieve the others. She would need to do impossible things. But impossibility was just another word for faith, and Mary Louise had faith in abundance. Captain Nguyen Van Thou received word that 2 of his men had been killed by an unknown weapon. Not rifles, not grenades. Something silent. Something that struck from the darkness without warning. A chill ran down his spine. He had heard stories from the older soldiers, tales of American demons who could move through the jungle unseen, who killed without sound, who were more ghost than human. He had always dismissed these stories as superstition. Now he was not so sure. The battle had been raging for approximately 45 minutes. Sergeant Thornton and the surviving members of the patrol, now numbering only 6, had managed to establish a defensive perimeter behind a cluster of boulders near a small stream. They had recovered the radio from Chen's body and transmitted a distress call, but extraction helicopters would not arrive for at least another hour. The landing zone was too hot. They were on their own. Thornton had lost track of Mary Louise in the chaos of the firefight. He assumed she was dead. Almost everyone assumed she was dead. They did not know that at that very moment she was approximately 200 meters northwest of their position, stalking through the jungle with 2 bloody knives in her hands and a cold fire burning in her heart. She had retrieved her weapons from the bodies of the men she had killed. She had also taken one of their rifles and 2 magazines of ammunition. The AK-47 felt strange in her hands, heavier than her M16, with a different balance and recoil pattern. But a weapon was a weapon, and Mary Louise was nothing if not adaptable. She moved toward the sound of the heaviest enemy fire, the sound that told her where the main body of North Vietnamese soldiers was concentrated. She was going to buy her friends more time, even if it killed her. The enemy soldiers never saw her coming. She emerged from the undergrowth like a nightmare made flesh, firing the AK-47 in short. Precise bursts, dropping 3 men before they could react. When the rifle clicked empty, she did not pause to reload. She threw her knife, catching a fourth soldier in the chest, and then she was among them with her second blade, moving with a speed and ferocity that defied comprehension. The hand-to-hand combat that followed lasted perhaps 90 seconds. It felt like an eternity. Mary Louise later told Army investigators that she did not remember most of it. She remembered the smell of blood and gunpowder. She remembered the screaming, hers and theirs. She remembered the weight of bodies falling around her. She remembered a moment of absolute clarity when she looked into the eyes of a young enemy soldier and saw her own reflection staring back at her, saw the same fear, the same determination, the same refusal to surrender. She killed him anyway. She had no choice. When the killing was done, 9 enemy soldiers lay dead in a circle approximately 15 meters in diameter. Mary Louise was wounded in 3 places. A bullet had grazed her left shoulder. A bayonet had opened a gash along her right rib cage. A piece of shrapnel had embedded itself in her left thigh. She was bleeding heavily. She was also still standing. The radio crackled with Thornton's voice, desperate, urgent. The enemy was mounting a final assault on their position. They were almost out of ammunition. They were going to be overrun. Mary Louise looked down at her wounds, at the blood soaking through her uniform, at the carnage that surrounded her. She had already done the impossible. Now she was going to do it again. She retrieved her knives from the bodies of the fallen. She collected every weapon and piece of ammunition she could carry. And then she began to move toward the sound of the guns, toward her friends, toward the final battle that would determine whether any of them would see another sunrise. Captain Nguyen Van Tao was preparing to order the assault when one of his lieutenants came running with news that made his blood run cold. A single American soldier, a woman, had attacked the reserve platoon and killed 9 men in hand-to-hand combat. 9 men, 1 woman. The lieutenant's voice was shaking as he described the scene. Bodies everywhere, throats cut, skulls split, knives embedded in flesh. It looked, the lieutenant said, like the work of a demon. Thao felt something he had not felt since his first firefight in 1962. He felt fear, not of the American helicopters that would eventually arrive, not of the bombs and napalm that the imperialists would rain down from the sky. He was afraid of a single woman who was somewhere in this jungle, wounded and bleeding, yet still hunting his men like prey. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He ordered his forces to withdraw. The ambush had been successful. The American patrol had been effectively destroyed. There was no tactical reason to continue the engagement, especially with extraction helicopters likely inbound. His men began to melt back into the jungle, carrying their wounded and leaving their dead. Mary Louise emerged from the tree line approximately 10 minutes after the enemy withdrawal began. Sergeant Thornton later said that he almost shot her. She looked like something from a horror film, her uniform torn and soaked with blood, her face streaked with mud and crimson, her eyes holding an expression that he had never seen in a human being before. It was the look of someone who had walked through the valley of the shadow of death and emerged on the other side as something more, or perhaps something less, than human. She collapsed at the edge of the defensive perimeter. Thornton caught her before she hit the ground. She was still conscious, barely, her lips moving in words that he could not understand. She was speaking in Navajo, repeating a prayer that her grandmother had taught her as a child, a prayer for the souls of the dead, for those she had killed and those who had been killed around her. She prayed for her enemies as well as her friends. She prayed for forgiveness. She prayed for peace. The extraction helicopters arrived at 16:47 hours. Mary Louise was evacuated to the 71st Evacuation Hospital at Pleiku, where surgeons worked for 6 hours to repair the damage to her body. She received 327 stitches. She required 4 units of blood. She was not expected to survive the night. But Mary Louise Begay was not finished defying expectations. The official after-action report, classified for 35 years and only released in 2003, credited Private First Class Begay with 17 confirmed enemy kills during the engagement, 11 by gunfire, 6 by knife, 6. The report noted that her actions had prevented the complete annihilation of the patrol and had likely saved the lives of 6 American soldiers. It recommended her for the Medal of Honor. The recommendation was denied. The reasons for the denial were never officially stated. Some historians believe it was because Mary Louise was a woman, and the political implications of awarding the nation's highest military honor to a female combat soldier in 1968 were considered too explosive. Others suggest that the circumstances of her kills, particularly the hand-to-hand combat with knives, were considered too savage for public consumption. A woman butchering enemy soldiers with hand-forged blades did not fit the image that the Pentagon wanted to project. Whatever the reason, Mary Louise was instead awarded the Silver Star, the 3rd highest combat decoration, with a citation that was deliberately vague about the specific nature of her heroism. She never complained about this injustice. She never spoke publicly about what happened in that valley. She spent 3 months recovering in various military hospitals before being medically discharged in August of 1968. She returned to the reservation, to the high desert and the sacred mountains, to the silence and the stars. She married a man named Thomas Yellowhorse, a Korean War veteran who understood without needing to be told what she had experienced. They raised 4 children. She taught them all to throw knives. But the story does not end there. It cannot end there. Because what happened in that valley in February of 1968 was not simply a remarkable act of individual heroism. It was something else entirely. Something that the army tried to suppress, and that only now, more than 50 years later, is beginning to come to light. The knives that Mary Louise carried were not ordinary weapons. According to documents recently discovered in the National Archives, they were examined by Army intelligence officers after the battle and found to contain metallurgical properties that should not have been possible for blades forged in 1928. The steel showed evidence of folding techniques similar to those used by Japanese swordsmiths, techniques that were unknown in the American Southwest at that time. Furthermore, the blades bore faint engravings that matched no known Navajo artistic tradition. When photographs of these engravings were shown to anthropologists at the Smithsonian Institution, they were identified as belonging to an ancient and largely unknown culture that predated the Navajo arrival in the region by at least 1,000 years. Mary Louise's grandfather, the man who had supposedly forged the knives from car parts, died in 1941. Before his death, he told his family a story that had been passed down through countless generations, a story about warriors who came from the stars in the time before time, who taught the people how to fight, how to hunt, how to survive in a world filled with enemies. These star warriors, he said, had left behind certain objects of power, objects that would reveal themselves to those who were worthy, those who had the blood of the ancient ones flowing in their veins. Was Mary Louise Begay chosen by some force beyond human understanding? Did she carry into battle weapons that were not of this earth, weapons that gave her abilities beyond those of normal soldiers? The army clearly believed something unusual was happening. The classified files contain references to a program codenamed Starfall, which was apparently tasked with investigating incidents of seemingly supernatural combat performance by American soldiers. Mary Louise's case was listed as Priority 1. The Starfall files have never been declassified. Freedom of information requests have been denied on grounds of national security. The soldiers who investigated Mary Louise's equipment have all died, most of them under circumstances that official records describe as accidents or natural causes. The knives themselves disappeared from the evidence locker at Fort Bragg in 1972. They have never been recovered. Mary Louise Begay passed away on June 15, 2019, at the age of 74. She was buried on the reservation, in a small cemetery overlooking the valley where she had played as a child. According to her family, her last words were in Navajo, a phrase that translates roughly as "the stars are calling me home." Her great-granddaughter, a young woman named Sarah Begay, enlisted in the United States Army in 2020. She's currently serving with the 82nd Airborne Division. According to her mother, Sarah has been having dreams lately, dreams about a valley in a faraway jungle, dreams about knives that sing when they fly through the air, dreams about a great-grandmother she never met who is trying to tell her something important. Sarah has never mentioned these dreams to her commanding officers, but she has started carrying something in her pocket, something that her grandmother gave her before she deployed, something wrapped in old leather that has been in the family for generations. She will not say what it is. Perhaps some secrets are meant to remain hidden. Perhaps there are mysteries that we are not meant to solve. But if you ever find yourself in the desert Southwest, driving through the Navajo Nation on a cold winter night, look up at the stars. Watch for movement among the constellations. Listen for whispers on the wind. And remember Mary Louise Begay, the woman who would not surrender, the warrior who called upon powers older than history itself to protect her brothers in arms. Remember her and ask yourself, what else might be waiting out there in the darkness between the stars, watching over those who carry the blood of the ancient ones? What else might be ready to answer when called? The official history books have tried to forget Mary Louise Begay. They have tried to reduce her to a footnote, a statistical anomaly, a curiosity to be explained away with rational arguments and bureaucratic indifference. But the truth has a way of refusing to stay buried. The truth has a way of finding its way to the surface, no matter how deep you try to dig the grave. In 1973, a journalist named Robert Kensington from the Washington Post began investigating rumors of extraordinary combat incidents that had been classified by the Pentagon. He was particularly interested in cases involving female soldiers, Native American soldiers, and anything that suggested abilities beyond normal human capacity. He found Mary Louise's file. He tracked down Sergeant Thornton, who by then had retired to a small farm outside of Savannah. Thornton told him everything. Kensington was preparing to publish his story when he received a visit from two men in dark suits, who showed credentials from an agency he had never heard of. They were polite but firm. The story could not be published. National security was at stake. If Kensington persisted, there would be consequences. The journalist was a brave man, but he was also a pragmatist. He had a wife and 2 children. He buried his notes in a safe deposit box and never spoke of Mary Louise again. He died of a heart attack in 1979. He was 43 years old. His wife always said that he had been in perfect health. The notes were discovered by his grandson in 2017. They form the basis of much of what we know about the classified aspects of Mary Louise's case. But they also raise questions that may never be answered. Kensington had uncovered evidence of at least 12 other incidents during the Vietnam War that bore similarities to the Begay case, soldiers who displayed impossible abilities in moments of extreme stress, weapons that seemed to guide themselves toward their targets, Native American soldiers in particular, who appeared to access some kind of ancestral power when their lives were threatened. The program called Starfall was apparently created to study these incidents. It was funded through black budget appropriations that left no paper trail. It reported directly to a committee that existed outside the normal chain of command. Its findings were never shared with the broader military or intelligence community. And after the fall of Saigon in 1975, it disappeared from the record entirely. Some researchers believe that Starfall was simply discontinued when the war ended. Others suggest that it was absorbed into a larger, more secret program that continues to this day. There are whispers in certain corners of the internet about soldiers who have been recruited for special operations based not on their physical abilities or combat experience, but on their genetic heritage, their ancestral bloodlines, their connection to powers that mainstream science does not acknowledge. These are whispers that the Pentagon has never confirmed or denied. What we know for certain is this: Mary Louise Begay walked into a valley in Vietnam with nothing but her courage and her grandfather's knives. She walked out having killed 17 enemy soldiers, having saved 6 American lives, having performed feats of combat that defied explanation. She never sought recognition or fame. She never tried to profit from her story. She went home to her people and lived a quiet life of service and family and faith. But she left something behind, something that cannot be measured in medals or citations or historical footnotes. She left a legacy of warrior spirit that stretches back through countless generations and forward into an unknown future. She proved that there are forces in this world, and perhaps beyond this world, that can be called upon in moments of desperate need. She proved that the human spirit, connected to something greater than itself, is capable of miracles. And she proved that the old ways, the ancient traditions, the sacred knowledge that has been passed down from grandparent to grandchild since the dawn of human memory, still have power, still have meaning, still matter. In a world that often seems to have forgotten its roots, that is perhaps the most important lesson of all. The 6 soldiers who survived that valley in February of 1968 were never the same. How could they be? They had witnessed something that shattered their understanding of what was possible, what was real, what existed in the spaces between the world they knew and the world they had been taught did not exist. Sergeant William Thornton, the man who had led the patrol and who had caught Mary Louise when she collapsed at the edge of their perimeter, spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of what he had seen. In 1987, nearly 2 decades after the battle, Thornton agreed to be interviewed by a military historian named Dr. Patricia Sandoval from the University of Texas at Austin. The interview was supposed to focus on standard tactical questions about ambush survival and small unit leadership. Instead, it became something else entirely. Thornton spoke for nearly 4 hours, his voice sometimes steady, sometimes breaking with emotion, as he described events that he had never shared with anyone outside his immediate family. "She moved like water," he said, his eyes distant, focused on something that Dr. Sandoval could not see. "I've served with some of the finest soldiers this country has ever produced. Rangers, special forces, men who could do things that seemed impossible. But I've never seen anything like what Mary Louise did that day. It was not just skill. It was not just training. It was something else, something that came from a place I do not have the words to describe. When she came out of that jungle, covered in blood, with those knives in her hands, I felt like I was looking at something ancient, something that existed before America, before Europe, before history itself. She was not just a soldier. She was a channel for something greater than any of us could understand." Dr. Sandoval's interview was never published. Her department chair received a phone call from Washington 2 weeks after she submitted her manuscript for review. The publication was not approved. Dr. Sandoval was encouraged to focus her research on other aspects of the Vietnam War. She complied, but not before making copies of the interview tapes and hiding them in 3 different locations. Those tapes surfaced in 2015, years after her death from cancer, discovered by a former graduate student who had been entrusted with her papers. The testimonies from the other survivors were equally disturbing. Corporal Michael Redhawk, a Cherokee from Oklahoma, who had been wounded in the initial ambush, described watching Mary Louise engage the enemy flanking force from approximately 30 meters away. His account, recorded in a private journal that his family released to researchers in 2008, contains details that military analysts have struggled to explain. "I saw her throw that first knife," Red Hawk wrote. "I was lying on my back with a bullet in my gut, watching the canopy spin above me when I heard this sound, like a whisper, like someone singing very far away. And then I turned my head and I saw her arm move, and I saw this flash of silver, and I saw that enemy soldier go down. But here is the thing that I have never been able to get out of my head. The knife should not have reached him. The distance was wrong. The angle was wrong. Physics says that throw was impossible. But I watched it happen. I watched it curve in the air. I watched it find its target like it was guided by something, like it knew where it needed to go." Red Hawk died in 1992, complications from the wounds he had received in Vietnam finally catching up with him. But before he passed, he had one final conversation with his son, a conversation that the family has only recently made public. He told his son that he had seen Mary Louise again, not in person, but in dreams. She came to him on the nights when the pain was worst, when the memories threatened to overwhelm him. She did not speak. She simply sat with him, her presence a comfort that no medicine could provide, and she was not alone. Behind her, he said, there were others, figures dressed in the clothing of warriors from times beyond memory, figures whose faces shifted and changed like smoke, figures whose eyes held the light of distant stars. "They are watching over us," Red Hawk told his son in his final hours. "All of us who were there that day, they claimed us, and when we die, they will be waiting." The Army's official investigation into the incident was completed in March of 1968. It concluded that Private First Class Mary Louise Begay had displayed extraordinary heroism under fire and recommended her for the Silver Star, which she received in a quiet ceremony at Walter Reed Army Medical Center while she was still recovering from her wounds. The citation praised her marksmanship and medical skills. It made no mention of the knives. It made no mention of the hand-to-hand combat. It made no mention of the 17 enemy soldiers who had died at her hands. But there was another investigation, one that was never acknowledged publicly, one that operated under the code name Ancient Thunder. This investigation was conducted by a joint task force that included representatives from Army Intelligence, the Defense Intelligence Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, and an organization that the surviving documents refer to only as the Office of Ancestral Studies. The existence of this office has never been confirmed by any government agency. Freedom of information requests have returned the same response for 50 years. No records found. The Ancient Thunder investigation focused not on Mary Louise's actions during the battle, but on the weapons she had used and the abilities she had displayed. The task force collected physical evidence from the battlefield, including soil samples from the locations where enemy soldiers had fallen to her knives. They interviewed the surviving members of the patrol. They attempted to interview Mary Louise herself, but she refused to cooperate, citing her right to privacy as a discharged veteran. They contacted her family on the reservation, but the Begay clan closed ranks, refusing to speak with anyone from the government about Mary Louise or her grandfather, or the knives that had been passed down through generations. What the investigation discovered, according to fragments of documentation that have leaked over the decades, was deeply troubling to those involved. The soil samples from the knife kills showed unusual properties. The blood that had soaked into the earth appeared to have been partially transmuted, its chemical composition altered in ways that laboratory technicians could not explain. Iron content was elevated by nearly 300%. Trace elements were detected that had no business being present in human blood. Most disturbing of all, the samples exhibited what one analyst described as residual electromagnetic activity, as if something had passed through the blood that left a signature, like a fingerprint, that persisted long after death. The knives themselves, before they disappeared from the evidence locker at Fort Bragg, were subjected to extensive metallurgical analysis. The results were classified at the highest level, but a memorandum from the lead analyst has survived. It states simply, composition inconsistent with any known terrestrial alloy. Recommend immediate transfer to Project Blue Book for further study. Project Blue Book, as many of you know, was the Air Force program responsible for investigating unidentified flying objects. It was officially terminated in 1969, but rumors have persisted for decades that its work continued under other names, in other agencies, in facilities that do not appear on any map. The connection between Mary Louise's knives and the UFO phenomenon may seem strange, even absurd, but consider what we know. The weapons were allegedly forged by her grandfather in 1928 from ordinary automobile parts. Yet they displayed properties that should have been impossible for that era's technology. They bore engravings that matched no known Native American tradition, engravings that anthropologists traced to a culture that predated the Navajo by a millennium or more. And they performed, in the hands of Mary Louise Begay, feats that defied the laws of physics as we understand them. The Navajo have their own explanations for these mysteries. Their oral traditions speak of the Star People, beings who came from the sky in the time before the emergence, who taught the first humans how to survive in a dangerous world. These traditions describe weapons of power, objects that could be awakened by those who carried the proper bloodline, objects that connected their wielders to forces that existed outside of ordinary time and space. The Star People, according to these stories, did not simply give their gifts and depart. They remained, watching from the shadows, waiting for moments when their descendants would need them most. Mary Louise never confirmed or denied these beliefs. In the few interviews she gave after returning to civilian life, she spoke only of her training, her faith, and her determination to protect the men she served with. When asked about the knives, she would change the subject. When pressed, she would simply smile and say that some things were not meant to be discussed with strangers. Her family maintains the same silence to this day, but the evidence suggests that something extraordinary happened in that valley, something that goes beyond individual heroism, something that touches on questions about human potential, ancestral memory, and the nature of reality itself. In 2001, a retired intelligence analyst named Harrison Cole published a book titled Weapons of the Ancestors, Classified Investigations into Paranormal Combat Phenomena. The book was largely ignored by mainstream media, dismissed as conspiracy theory and fantasy, but it contained details about the Begay case that had never been made public before, details that Cole claimed to have obtained from sources within the intelligence community who were disturbed by the government's continued suppression of the truth. According to Cole, the Ancient Thunder investigation concluded that Mary Louise Begay had accessed what they termed an ancestral combat matrix, a kind of genetic memory that allowed her to channel skills and abilities that had been developed by her predecessors over thousands of years. The knives served as activation keys, objects that resonated with specific frequencies encoded in her DNA, unlocking capacities that lay dormant in most humans. The investigation theorized that this capacity was not unique to Mary Louise, but was potentially present in all humans, though more accessible to those with unbroken connections to ancient warrior traditions. Cole's book also revealed that the Office of Ancestral Studies had identified at least 47 other incidents during the 20th century in which individuals appeared to have accessed similar abilities. These incidents spanned multiple conflicts, from World War I to the Gulf War. They involved soldiers from diverse ethnic backgrounds, including Native Americans, African Americans with connections to West African warrior traditions, Irish Americans with Celtic heritage, and Japanese Americans whose families had preserved samurai disciplines. In each case, The individuals had displayed abilities in combat that exceeded normal human parameters. In each case, their equipment had shown anomalous properties, and in each case, the incidents had been classified and suppressed. The implications of this research were apparently so disturbing that the Office of Ancestral Studies was disbanded in 1993. Its files were scattered across multiple agencies. Its personnel were reassigned or retired. Its very existence was erased from the official record. But the knowledge it had gathered did not disappear. It simply went underground, into black programs and compartmentalized projects that continue to operate outside of public oversight. There are those who believe that the military has been actively recruiting individuals with ancestral connections to warrior traditions, seeking to harness their abilities for modern warfare. There are whispers of special operations units composed entirely of personnel selected for their genetic heritage rather than their conventional qualifications. There are rumors of training programs that incorporate ancient rituals, ceremonial objects, and techniques that have been passed down through indigenous cultures for countless generations. These rumors cannot be confirmed. The evidence is fragmentary, circumstantial, easily dismissed by those who prefer to believe that the world operates according to simple, rational rules. But the testimony of men like William Thornton and Michael Redhawk cannot be so easily dismissed. They were there, they saw what happened, and they carried the weight of that knowledge until the day they died. What does this mean for us today? In a world that seems increasingly disconnected from its roots, its traditions, its ancient wisdom, perhaps it means that we have forgotten something essential about ourselves. Perhaps we have allowed the noise of modern life to drown out the voices of our ancestors, voices that still speak to us in our dreams, in our moments of crisis, in the depths of our souls. Perhaps the power that Mary Louise channeled in that jungle valley is not something rare and exceptional, but something that lives within all of us, waiting to be awakened, waiting to be called upon in our darkest hours. The Navajo teach that every person walks in beauty, surrounded by the spirits of those who came before, guided by forces that cannot be seen but can always be felt. They teach that courage is not the absence of fear, but the presence of something greater, a connection to the eternal, a faith in powers beyond human comprehension. They teach that the warrior's path is not one of violence, but one of protection, of sacrifice, of love so fierce that it transcends death itself. Mary Louise Begay walked that path. She faced impossible odds with nothing but her skill, her faith, and 3 knives that carried the weight of 1,000 generations. She did not fight for glory or recognition. She fought for the men beside her, the brothers she had chosen, the family she had made in the crucible of war. And when the history books tried to forget her, when the bureaucrats filed away her story in classified folders and locked vaults, she did not complain. She went home. She raised her children. She tended her sheep and watched the sun set over the mesas and prayed for peace. But her story refuses to stay buried. It emerges in fragments, in whispers, in dreams that haunt those who were touched by her presence. It lives in the eyes of her great-granddaughter Sarah, who carries something ancient in her pocket as she serves her country, just as Mary Louise did more than 50 years ago. It echoes through the canyons and deserts of the Southwest, where the wind still carries the songs of the Star People, still whispers secrets to those who know how to listen. And it speaks to all of us, regardless of our heritage, our background, our beliefs. It reminds us that we are more than the sum of our parts, more than flesh and blood and bone. We carry within us the accumulated wisdom of countless generations, the strength of ancestors who survived impossible challenges, the spirit of warriors who never surrendered even when all seemed lost. We carry within us the potential for miracles. The question is whether we will have the courage to access it, whether we will have the faith to believe in something greater than ourselves. Whether we will, when our moment of testing comes, reach into the depths of our souls and find what Mary Louise found in that valley, surrounded by enemies, with no ammunition left and no hope of rescue. She found the strength of her ancestors. She found the power of her faith. She found the weapons that had been waiting for her, passed down through generations, forged in fires that burned before history began. She found, in the end, God, because that is what this story is ultimately about. Not warfare, not paranormal phenomena, not government conspiracies or ancient aliens or genetic secrets. This story is about the divine spark that lives within each of us, the connection to something eternal and infinite that can never be destroyed, no matter how hard the powers of this world try to suppress it. Mary Louise did not survive that day because of superior training or lucky circumstances, or even the mysterious properties of her grandfather's knives. She survived because she was connected to the Creator, to the source of all strength and all courage and all love. The Navajo people have always understood this truth. They call the Creator different names, speak of him in different ways, but the essence is the same. There is a power that sustains the universe, that breathes life into every living thing, that watches over his children in their moments of greatest need. This power cannot be classified or controlled or hidden away in government vaults. It cannot be explained by science or dismissed by skeptics. It simply is, eternal and unchanging, available to all who seek it with sincere hearts. Jesus Christ spoke of this power when he told his disciples that with faith the size of a mustard seed, they could move mountains. He demonstrated this power when he healed the sick, raised the dead, and conquered death itself through his resurrection. He offers this power to all who believe in him, to all who accept his sacrifice and open their hearts to his love. Mary Louise Begay was a Christian. She had been baptized as a child in a small church on the reservation, had learned the stories of the Bible alongside the stories of her Navajo ancestors, had found no contradiction between the faith of her fathers and the faith of Christ. She understood that the star people her grandmother spoke of were not separate from God, but part of his creation, angels or messengers sent to guide and protect his children throughout history. She understood that the power in her grandfather's knives was not magic but grace, not sorcery but blessing. And she understood that when she walked into that valley, she did not walk alone. Christ walked with her. The Holy Spirit guided her hands. The Father watched over her with the same love that he watches over all his children, in all times and places, in all circumstances of joy and sorrow and desperate struggle. This is the truth that the government tried to hide. Not that Mary Louise had supernatural abilities, but that those abilities came from God. Not that ancient peoples possessed mysterious technologies, but that they possessed faith. Deep and unwavering faith in the Creator who had formed them from the dust of the earth and breathed his spirit into their lungs. The establishment fears this truth because it cannot be controlled, it cannot be weaponized, it cannot be bought or sold or contained in classified files. It can only be received freely by those who humble themselves before the Lord. If you are watching this video, I want you to know that the same power that sustained Mary Louise Begay in her darkest hour is available to you. Right now, in this moment, you do not need ancient knives or special bloodlines or secret knowledge. You need only faith. You need only to cry out to Jesus Christ, to accept him as your Lord and Savior, to trust that he will never leave you or forsake you, no matter what challenges you face. The enemies that surround you may not carry AK-47 rifles, but they are just as real. Depression, addiction, despair, loneliness, fear, the forces of darkness that seek to steal your joy, kill your hope, and destroy your future. But you do not have to face them alone. You never have to face them alone. Call upon the name of Jesus. Reach out to him in prayer. Open your Bible and read his promises. Find a church, a community of believers who will support you and encourage you and walk beside you on this journey. And remember Mary Louise Begay, the warrior woman who proved that with God, all things are possible. Her story is not finished. The mystery continues. The questions remain unanswered. What happened to the knives? What did the Office of Ancestral Studies really discover? What does Sarah Begay carry in her pocket as she serves overseas? And what dreams visit her in the darkness of foreign nights? These questions may never be resolved in this lifetime. But there is one question that can be resolved today, in this moment, the question of your eternal destiny. The question of where you will stand when you face your own valley, your own ambush, your own moment of impossible odds. Will you stand with the Lord? Will you trust in His strength when your own runs out? Will you believe that He has prepared weapons for you, spiritual weapons of faith and hope and love that can defeat any enemy? The choice is yours. It has always been yours. But remember the lesson of Mary Louise Begay. Remember what happens when a single person, armed with nothing but faith and the heritage of the ancients, refuses to surrender. Remember that the darkness cannot overcome the light, no matter how overwhelming it appears. And remember to look up at the stars tonight, somewhere out there, in the vast expanse of God's creation. There are forces watching over us, forces that have guarded humanity since the beginning, forces that will continue to guard us until the end of time. Mary Louise knew this. She trusted this, and because of that trust, she accomplished the impossible. Now, it is your turn. Go in peace. Go in faith. Go in the knowledge that you are never, ever alone. And subscribe to this channel, because we have many more stories to tell, stories that they do not want you to hear, stories of courage and faith and the mysterious workings of God in human history. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling us your thoughts. Until next time, may God bless you and keep you. May His face shine upon you and give you peace. And may you always remember that with faith, you can never truly run out of ammunition. Knowing that with every single step, you could be blown into pieces too small for your mother to recognize. What if the only thing standing between you and certain death was a pocket watch and a strange rhythm your grandfather taught you when you were 7 years old? Tonight, I'm going to tell you the true story of a man who did exactly that. A Cherokee scout who walked into a minefield that had already claimed 11 American lives and walked out again after finding 40 German mines buried beneath the French soil. He did not trigger a single one. And the method he used? The United States Army still cannot fully explain it. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me. Drop a comment right now telling me where you're watching from. I want to know which state, which country, which corner of this world is listening to this story tonight. And if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that button. This channel survives because of people like you who help us share these hidden stories that the history books forgot. We need your support to keep bringing you the truth that others want to bury. Now let me take you back to a cold morning in November of 1944. The village was called Saint-Avold, a small cluster of stone buildings in the Moselle region of northeastern France, just 23 kilometers from the German border. By the time the American forces arrived, the village had changed hands 3 times. First the French held it, then the Germans took it in 1940. Then the Americans pushed through in September of 44, only to lose it again during a fierce counterattack in October. Now, in the bitter cold of November, they were trying to take it back for good. The problem was the field. Between the American position and the village lay approximately 800 meters of open farmland. The soil was dark and wet from weeks of autumn rain. The grass had been trampled flat by artillery fire, and somewhere beneath that innocent-looking earth, the Germans had buried enough explosives to kill every man in the approaching battalion. They called them shrapnel mine or S-mines, but the American soldiers had their own name for them, Bouncing Betties. The design was simple and horrifying. When triggered, a small charge would launch the mine approximately 1 meter into the air. Then the main charge would detonate, sending 360 steel balls in every direction at lethal velocity. A single mine could kill or maim every soldier within a 25-meter radius. The Germans had reportedly buried dozens of them in the field outside Saint-Avold. The first attempt to cross had been a disaster. On the morning of November 9th, a squad of 11 men from the 80th Infantry Division attempted to advance through the field using standard mine detection equipment. The SCR-625 mine detector, a device that looked like a metal disc attached to a long pole, was supposed to emit a tone when it passed over buried metal. In theory, this would allow soldiers to locate and mark mines for later disposal. In practice, the device failed completely. The first man to die was Private Harold Benson from Tulsa, Oklahoma. He was 22 years old. According to the after-action report filed by Lieutenant James Whitmore, Benson was sweeping the detector across the ground in careful arcs when he suddenly stepped on something. The witnesses reported hearing a soft click, then a brief hiss as the mine launched itself into the air. Benson had time to look down before the explosion tore through his midsection. 3 more men died trying to retrieve his body. The mines had been placed in overlapping patterns, each one positioned to catch anyone who rushed to help a fallen comrade. By the time the surviving soldiers managed to retreat, 7 men were dead, and 4 were critically wounded. The medical officer who examined the bodies, Captain Ernest Redhawk, wrote in his report that several of the deceased were unrecognizable due to the severity of their injuries. The 80th Infantry Division was paralyzed. They could not advance through the field without being slaughtered. They could not go around the field because German artillery had zeroed in on both flanking routes. And they could not wait because intelligence reports indicated that a German armored column was moving towards Saint-Avold from the east. If the Americans did not take the village within 48 hours, they would be caught between 2 enemy forces and annihilated. That night, in a farmhouse cellar that served as the temporary command post, Colonel William Patterson gathered his officers to discuss their options. The conversation was brief and grim. Every conventional approach had been considered and rejected. Mine-clearing tanks were unavailable. Artillery bombardment might detonate some mines, but would also alert the Germans to the upcoming assault. Sending more men with metal detectors was simply murder by another name. It was during this meeting that Captain Redhawk spoke up. "I have someone who might be able to help," he said. The other officers turned to look at him. Redhawk was respected, but somewhat mysterious. A member of the Cherokee Nation from Tahlequah, Oklahoma. He had joined the Army Medical Corps in 1941 and had served with distinction in North Africa and Italy before being transferred to the European theater. He rarely spoke about his background, but the men under his command whispered that he came from a family of medicine people, healers who possessed knowledge that went back centuries. "Who do you have in mind, Captain?" Colonel Patterson asked. Redhawk hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to share something that might sound insane. "There is a man in the scout company," he said finally. "His name is Joseph Runningwater. He is Cherokee, like me. We grew up in the same town. His grandfather was a watchmaker who also served as a ceremonial drumkeeper for our people." Patterson frowned. "I failed to see how that qualifies him to walk through a minefield, Captain." "With respect, sir," Redhawk replied, "you have not seen what Joseph can do with sound." The meeting adjourned without a decision, but the next morning Colonel Patterson summoned Joseph Runningwater to the command post. The man who entered the cellar was not what Patterson had expected. Runningwater was 31 years old, lean and weathered, with black hair cut short beneath his helmet and dark eyes that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. He moved with an unusual stillness, each gesture economical and precise. He had been serving as a scout for the past 6 months, specializing in night reconnaissance and silent movement behind enemy lines. His record was impeccable, not a single mission failure. "Runningwater," Patterson said, "Captain Redhawk tells me you have a unique skill. Something to do with sound and your grandfather. Joseph did not answer immediately. He looked at Red Hawk, who nodded slightly. My grandfather taught me to listen, Running Water said. His voice was low and measured. He was a watchmaker in Tahlequah for 40 years. He could tell you what was wrong with a timepiece just by holding it to his ear, but he was also a keeper of drums for our ceremonies. He understood that everything in this world has a vibration, a frequency, even things that are hidden beneath the surface. Patterson leaned forward. What exactly are you proposing, soldier? I am proposing to find your minds, sir. The colonel studied him for a long moment. And how do you intend to do that without getting yourself killed? Running Water reached into his jacket pocket and produced an object that seemed absurdly out of place in that blood-soaked cellar. It was a pocket watch, old brass-cased, with a simple white face and black numerals. The kind of watch a railroad conductor might have carried 50 years earlier. This belonged to my grandfather, Running Water said. It still works perfectly. And when I hold it to the ground and wind it, the vibration travels through the soil. When that vibration reaches something hollow, something like a mine casing, the sound changes. I can hear it. Colonel Patterson stared at the watch, then at Running Water, then at Red Hawk. He looked like a man trying to decide whether he was dealing with a genius or a madman. You are telling me, he said slowly, that you can find buried mines by listening to a pocket watch. Not just any pocket watch, sir. This one is special. My grandfather modified it. He added a secondary spring that creates a specific resonance. When I tap the case in a certain rhythm, it produces a sound wave that penetrates the ground. I have done this before. I found unexploded ordnance on a farm in Tahlequah when I was 14. The Army Corps of Engineers had missed 3 shells that I located in 20 minutes. Patterson turned to Red Hawk. Is he telling the truth? Every word, sir. I was there when it happened. The silence in the cellar stretched out for nearly a minute. Outside, somewhere in the distance, artillery rumbled like approaching thunder. Patterson thought about the 11 dead men in the field. He thought about the German armored column moving towards Saint-Avold. He thought about his own orders, which demanded that he take the village at any cost. Finally, he spoke. Running Water, if you can find even half those mines, I will personally write to the War Department and recommend you for the Silver Star. But I need to understand exactly what you plan to do. Joseph nodded and pulled a small leather bundle from his other pocket. He unwrapped it carefully to reveal a thin wooden rod, about 12 inches long, polished smooth by years of handling. This is a drum beater, he explained. It belonged to my grandfather as well. He used it for ceremonies, but also for testing watch mechanisms. The wood comes from a red oak tree that was struck by lightning. My grandfather believed this gave it special properties for conducting sound. He set the drum beater on the table beside the pocket watch. Here is what I will do, he continued. I will enter the field before dawn, when the ground is coldest and the soil is most compact. Cold soil transmits vibration better than warm soil. I will move slowly, one step at a time. Before each step, I will kneel and place the watch against the ground. I will wind it 3 times and then tap the case with the drum beater in a specific pattern. Then I will listen. Listen for what? Patterson asked. For the echo, sir. When the sound wave from the watch hits solid earth, it returns in a certain way. But when it hits a hollow space, like the casing of a mine, the echo is different, higher, sharper, like a drum with a crack in the skin. And you can really hear that difference? Running Water smiled faintly. Colonel, my grandfather could hear a broken gear in a watch from across a room. He spent 30 years teaching me to listen. By the time I was 10, I could hear a squirrel moving through leaves from 200 yards away. I once tracked a deer through a forest at night using only my ears. Yes, sir, I can hear the difference. Patterson exchanged a glance with his other officers. Their expressions ranged from skepticism to desperate hope. Finally, the colonel made his decision. "You have my permission to try," he said, "but you go alone. I will not risk more men on this unless you can prove it works." "Understood, sir." "One more thing," Patterson added. "If you find a mine, you mark it and move on. You do not attempt to disarm anything. Just find them and get out. We have engineers for the rest." Running Water nodded. He gathered his grandfather's watch and drumbeater, wrapping them carefully in the leather bundle. As he turned to leave, he paused at the cellar stairs. "Colonel," he said quietly, "my grandfather had a saying. He told me that the earth speaks to those who know how to listen. The Germans think they have hidden their weapons where no one can find them. But nothing is truly hidden. Everything makes a sound if you know how to hear it." Then he climbed the stairs and disappeared into the grey November dawn. The night before the mission, Joseph Running Water did something that none of the other soldiers understood. He fasted. Beginning at sunset on November 10th, he consumed nothing but water. He spent the evening hours sitting alone in a ruined barn on the edge of the American encampment, his eyes closed, his breathing slow and deep. A few soldiers who passed by reported that he appeared to be meditating or praying. One man said he heard strange sounds coming from the barn, a low humming that seemed to vibrate in the chest, even from 20 yards away. What Running Water was actually doing was preparing his senses. His grandfather had taught him that the body was like an instrument. To hear clearly, you had to remove all interference. Food in the stomach created noise, internal gurgles and movements that could mask subtle sounds from the outside world. The humming was a vocal exercise, a way of calibrating the ears by producing a known tone and listening to how it reflected off surrounding surfaces. By midnight, Running Water felt ready. His hearing had sharpened to an almost painful degree. He could hear soldiers whispering in a foxhole 300 yards away. He could hear the distant creak of a German artillery piece being wheeled into position somewhere across the valley. And underneath all of it, he could hear something else, a faint, irregular pulse coming from the field where the mines were buried. It was the sound of death waiting. At 3:45 in the morning, Joseph Running Water crawled out of the barn and made his way to the forward observation post. Captain Redhawk was waiting for him, along with a young lieutenant named Thomas Blackwood, who had been assigned to observe the mission. "Are you certain about this?" Redhawk asked quietly. Running Water adjusted the leather bundle in his jacket. "As certain as I have ever been about anything." Blackwood looked nervous. "The Army does not officially recognize," he began. "Lieutenant," Running Water interrupted gently, "I'm not asking the Army to recognize anything. I'm asking you to let me walk into that field before the sun comes up and the Germans can see me. Whatever happens after that is between me and the Creator." They synchronized their watches. At exactly 400 hours, Joseph Running Water slipped over the American trench line and began crawling toward the minefield. The grass was cold and wet against his belly. The sky above was a uniform grey, with no moon visible through the overcast clouds. Perfect conditions. The darkness would hide him from enemy observers, and the cold ground would transmit sound with maximum clarity. He reached the edge of the minefield approximately 15 minutes later. He knew he had arrived because of what he did not hear. The normal sounds of the earth, the tiny movements of insects, the settling of soil, the faint creaking of grass roots, all of it stopped abruptly at an invisible boundary. It was as if the land itself knew that death was buried there and had gone silent in fear. Running Water paused, breathing slowly, letting his heart rate drop. Then he reached into his jacket and removed his grandfather's watch. The brass case was cold in his palm. He could feel the tick of the mechanism through the metal, a steady pulse that reminded him of a heartbeat. He positioned himself flat against the ground, pressing his ear to the soil, and wound the watch exactly 3 times. Then he began to tap. The rhythm was specific, a pattern of 5 beats that his grandfather had taught him decades ago. 3 quick taps, a pause, then 2 slow taps. the rhythm of a heart that is listening. With each tap, the watch produced a subtle vibration that traveled down through the case, through his fingers, and into the cold French earth. Running Water closed his eyes and listened. At first, he heard nothing unusual. The sound waves spread through the soil in all directions, bouncing off rocks, roots, and buried debris. It was like listening to a crowded room and trying to pick out a single conversation, but his grandfather had trained him for this. He filtered out the background noise, focusing only on the specific frequency that indicated a hollow space. And then he heard it, about 3 meters ahead and slightly to his left, a faint echo that was higher and sharper than the surrounding returns. The sound of metal containing empty space, the sound of a mine waiting to kill. Running Water reached into his pocket and removed a small wooden stake with a red cloth tied to the top. Moving with excruciating slowness, he crawled forward until he was within arm's reach of where he estimated the mine to be buried. He pushed the stake into the ground, marking the location. Then he retreated and began the process again. Tap, listen, mark, move. The sun had not yet risen when he found the 5th mine, then the 10th, then the 15th. Each one was buried at a slightly different depth, some only a few inches below the surface, others nearly a foot deep. The German engineers had done their work with terrible precision. The mines were arranged in a staggered pattern, designed to catch anyone who tried to zigzag through the field. But Running Water could hear them all. By the time the first grey light of dawn began to appear on the eastern horizon, he had marked 32 mines. His body was exhausted from the cold and the intense concentration required for each probe. His hands were numb and his ears were ringing from the effort of listening to sounds that existed on the very edge of human perception. But he was not finished. He could sense that there were more. The echoes told him that the pattern extended further than he had mapped, perhaps all the way to the edge of the village. If he stopped now, men would still die. Running Water pressed his grandfather's watch to the ground once more and tapped out the rhythm. What he heard made his blood freeze. Not just one echo, not 2 or 3. A cascade of hollow sounds, spreading out in every direction, layered on top of each other like whispers in a cathedral. The Germans had not just mined the field, they had created a death trap of overlapping kill zones, each mine positioned to trigger a chain reaction with its neighbors. And directly in the center of this nightmare, buried deeper than all the others, was something much larger. Running Water did not know what it was. A bomb, perhaps, or a central detonator designed to set off every mine simultaneously if the field was breached. Whatever it was, it pulsed with a low, heavy sound that seemed to press against his skull like a physical weight. He marked the location with a double stake and began to retreat. The sun was fully up by the time he crawled back into the American lines. His uniform was soaked with dew and mud. His face was pale, and his hands were trembling, but in his wake 40 red stakes protruded from the French earth, each one marking a place where death had been hiding. Lieutenant Blackwood was the first to reach him. "How many?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Running Water looked at him with exhausted eyes. 40 mines, he said, plus something else in the center, something big. Tell the colonel he needs to see this before anyone tries to cross. Blackwood stared at the field, at the seemingly random pattern of red stakes stretching into the distance. His skepticism had vanished completely, replaced by something that looked like awe. "How?" he asked. "How did you find them all?" Joseph Running Water smiled faintly and held up his grandfather's pocket watch. "I listened," he said simply. "The earth told me where they were." The news of what Running Water had accomplished spread through the American camp like wildfire. Within an hour, Colonel Patterson had personally inspected the marked minefield, accompanied by a team of Army engineers who were frankly astonished by what they saw. The stakes were positioned with remarkable precision. When the engineers carefully excavated the first few locations, they found German S-mines buried exactly where Running Water had indicated. Not one stake was misplaced. Not one mine had been missed. But the true revelation came when they investigated the center of the field. Buried nearly 2 feet beneath the surface was something the engineers had never seen before. A cylindrical device, approximately 4 feet long and 18 inches in diameter, connected by wire to at least 12 surrounding mines. The lead engineer, Captain Marcus Thornton, spent nearly an hour examining it before he emerged from the field with a pale face and trembling hands. "It is a daisy chain," he told Colonel Patterson. "The Germans rigged the entire field to explode simultaneously. If anyone had triggered one of those outer mines, it would have set off the central device, which would have detonated everything else. We would have lost 50 men at least, maybe 100. Patterson looked at Running Water, who was standing nearby with a cup of coffee that he had not yet touched. "How did you know it was there?" "The sound was different," Running Water replied. "Deeper, heavier, like a drum made of iron instead of wood. My grandfather taught me to listen for that kind of resonance. It usually means something dangerous." Colonel Patterson was not a man given to displays of emotion. He had commanded men through some of the bloodiest fighting of the war, and had learned to keep his feelings locked away, where they could not interfere with his duty. But at that moment, standing at the edge of a minefield that should have been a mass grave, he felt something he had not experienced in a long time. "Hope, soldier," he said quietly. "You just saved more lives than you will ever know." The assault on Centervold commenced the following morning. Thanks to Running Water's work, the engineers were able to clear a safe path through the minefield in less than 6 hours. The American forces crossed without a single casualty and took the village by noon. The German defenders, caught off guard by the speed of the advance, retreated in disarray. But the story of Joseph Running Water and his grandfather's watch did not end there. In the weeks that followed, word of his abilities reached higher and higher levels of command. He was summoned to a series of meetings with intelligence officers who wanted to understand how his technique worked. He demonstrated it repeatedly, locating buried metal objects with what seemed like supernatural precision. Each time, he tried to explain that there was nothing mystical about it. Just careful listening and an understanding of how sound moved through different materials. But the army was not interested in explanations that sounded like science. They were interested in results. By December of 1944, Joseph Running Water had been assigned to a special unit tasked with locating hidden enemy positions throughout the European theater. He found buried ammunition depots in Belgium. He discovered concealed artillery emplacements in Luxembourg. He even located a network of underground tunnels that the Germans were using to move troops behind American lines. And through it all, he carried his grandfather's pocket watch and drum beater, the only tools he ever needed. But there was something else happening, something that Running Water mentioned only in private letters to his family back in Oklahoma. Something that troubled him deeply. The more he listened to the earth, the more he heard things that he could not explain. Voices, not the voices of living men, something older, something that seemed to rise from the soil itself, speaking in languages he did not recognize. They whispered to him during his night missions, telling him secrets about the land he was walking on. They warned him of dangers that his technique should not have been able to detect, and sometimes, in the deepest hours of darkness, they seemed to be calling him somewhere, calling him home. But home was not Oklahoma. Home was somewhere beneath the ground. The winter of 1944 was one of the coldest in European memory. Snow fell continuously from mid-December through January, blanketing the countryside in white silence. The American forces pushed eastward through Belgium and Luxembourg, fighting the desperate German counter-offensive that would later be known as the Battle of the Bulge. And through it all, Joseph Running Water continued his strange work. By this point, his reputation had grown beyond anything he could have imagined. Officers who had never met him spoke his name with a mixture of respect and unease. The enlisted men told stories about the Cherokee scout who could hear minds talking to each other beneath the frozen earth. Some said he had made a deal with spirits. Others claimed he was simply the best trained tracker the army had ever produced. A few whispered that he was something else entirely, something that had existed long before the war and would continue long after it ended. Running Water paid no attention to the rumors. He was too busy listening. The voices had grown stronger since Saint-Evol. Every time he pressed his grandfather's watch to the ground and tapped out the sacred rhythm, he heard them more clearly. They spoke in fragments, broken phrases that seemed to drift up from impossible depths. Sometimes they sounded like Cherokee, the language of his childhood. Other times they spoke in tongues he had never encountered, ancient syllables that seemed to vibrate in the bones rather than the ears. And they always said the same thing: come deeper, come home. The truth is waiting. Running Water told no one about these messages. He knew how it would sound. The army had no use for soldiers who heard voices from underground. They would send him to a psychiatric ward and take away his grandfather's watch, and then he would never learn what the voices were trying to tell him. So he kept listening, and the voices kept calling. The mission that changed everything came in the final week of January 1945. American intelligence had received reports of a German research facility hidden somewhere in the Hürtgen forest, a dense woodland along the German-Belgian border that had already claimed thousands of American lives. The facility was rumored to be developing some kind of new weapon, though the details were unclear. What was clear was that the Germans were protecting it with everything they had. Colonel Patterson, who had since been promoted to command a larger tactical unit, personally requested that Running Water be attached to the reconnaissance team. The mission was simple in theory, but terrifying in practice. Find the facility, map its defenses, report back without being detected. The team consisted of 12 men, including Running Water and a young sergeant named William Crowfoot, another Native American soldier from the Lakota Nation who had heard stories about the Cherokee Scout and specifically requested to serve alongside him. They set out on the night of January 23rd, moving through the frozen forest under a moonless sky. The Hürtgen was unlike any place Running Water had ever experienced. The trees were ancient, their trunks twisted into shapes that seemed almost deliberate, as if something had been trying to spell out a message in wood and bark. The snow absorbed all sound, creating a silence so complete that it felt like pressure against the eardrums. And beneath that silence, Running Water could hear something else. The earth was screaming, not loudly, not in any way that the other soldiers could detect, but to Running Water's trained ears, the sound was unmistakable. A constant, low-frequency vibration that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. It was the sound of pain, the sound of something buried deep underground that desperately wanted to be free. He stopped the team about 2 miles into the forest and knelt to press his grandfather's watch against the frozen ground. "What is it?" Crowfoot whispered. Running Water did not answer immediately. He was listening to something that made no sense. The vibrations coming from below were not random. They formed a pattern, a rhythm, and that rhythm was familiar. It was the same pattern his grandfather had taught him decades ago. 3 quick beats, a pause, then 2 slow beats. The rhythm of a heart that is listening. Someone down there was tapping back. Running Water felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter cold. He had used his grandfather's technique hundreds of times. He had found mines, bombs, tunnels, and buried equipment, but he had never, not once, received a response, until now. "We need to keep moving," he told the team, "but stay close. Something is wrong here." They continued through the forest, following a narrow trail that wound between the ancient trees. Running Water kept his grandfather's watch in his hand, tapping occasionally and listening for the response. Each time it came. 3 quick beats, a pause, 2 slow beats, getting closer, getting clearer. After another hour of careful movement, they reached the edge of a clearing. What they saw there would haunt every man present for the rest of their lives. The German facility was not what they had expected. There were no barracks, no guard towers, no fence or defensive perimeter. Instead, there was simply a massive hole in the ground. The opening was roughly circular, perhaps 60 feet in diameter, with edges that looked like they had been carved rather than excavated. Stone steps spiraled down into the darkness, disappearing into depths that seemed to go on forever. Around the opening, the Germans had constructed a series of wooden platforms and pulley systems, the kind used for lowering equipment into mines. But these platforms were old, ancient even. The wood was grey and cracked, as if it had been standing there for centuries rather than years. And there was something else, symbols. They were carved into the stone around the opening, hundreds of them, forming concentric circles that radiated outward like ripples in a pond. Running Water did not recognize most of them. They were not German. They were not any European script he had ever seen. But scattered among the foreign symbols were others that made his heart stop. Cherokee syllabary, the writing system created by Sequoyah in the 1820s. The sacred characters that Running Water had learned as a child in Oklahoma. They were here, carved into ancient stone in the middle of a German forest. Thousands of miles from the land where they had been invented, impossible. And yet there they were. Crowfoot saw them too. His face went pale in the dim light. "How?" he breathed. "How are those here?" Running Water shook his head slowly. He had no answer. The voices from underground were louder now, almost deafening in their intensity. They were calling to him specifically, using words he could finally understand. "Grandson, you have come at last. The circle is complete." He stepped forward, drawn toward the opening by a force he could not resist. The other soldiers called out warnings, told him to stop, to wait, to think. But Running Water was beyond thinking. He was listening, and what he heard was the truth he had been seeking his entire life. His grandfather's technique was not just a way to find buried objects. It was a key. A method of communication passed down through countless generations, from a time when humans and the earth spoke the same language. The pocket watch, the drum beater, the sacred rhythm, all of it was part of something much older than the Cherokee Nation, something older than any nation, and it had been waiting for him here, in this impossible place, since before history began. Running Water reached the edge of the opening and looked down. The stone steps descended into darkness for perhaps 50 feet before reaching a landing. Beyond the landing he could see the faint glow of artificial light, flickering and unsteady like torches or candles. And from that glow came sounds. Mechanical sounds, the whir of machinery and the clank of metal on metal. But underneath those sounds was something else, breathing, slow, deep, rhythmic. The breath of something massive that was sleeping far below the surface of the earth. "We need to report this," one of the soldiers said. His voice was shaking. "We need to get out of here and tell command what we found." Running Water knew the man was right. The smart thing, the military thing, would be to retreat and report. Let the generals decide what to do. Let someone else descend into that darkness and discover what was waiting below. But the voices would not let him leave. They whispered promises, they showed him visions. His grandfather, young and strong, standing beside the opening with a smile on his face. His ancestors, stretching back through time, each one carrying the same pocket watch, each one practicing the same rhythm. And beyond them, further back than human memory could reach, something else. Something that had taught the first people how to listen. "I am going down," Running Water said. The other soldiers protested, they argued. One of them, a corporal from Tennessee, actually grabbed his arm and tried to pull him back, but Running Water shook him off with surprising strength. "Stay here," he commanded. "If I am not back in 1 hour, return to base and tell them what you saw. Tell them the Germans found something that should have stayed buried, and tell them it is awake." Before anyone could stop him, he stepped onto the first stone stair and began to descend. The steps were worn smooth by countless feet over countless years. The stone was cold through Running Water's boots, and the air grew colder with each step he took. The light from above faded quickly, replaced by a darkness so complete that he could not see his own hand in front of his face. But he did not need to see. He could hear. The breathing was louder now, closer, and with each breath came a pulse of sound that travelled through the stone itself, vibrating up through Running Water's feet and into his bones. It was a heartbeat, the heartbeat of the earth, and it was welcoming him home. He reached the first landing after what felt like an eternity. The flickering light was coming from ahead, through a tunnel carved into the rock. The walls of the tunnel were covered with more symbols, including more Cherokee characters that spelled out words Running Water could read. Listen, remember, return. He followed the tunnel for approximately 200 yards, descending gradually all the while. The air was different down here, thick and humid despite the cold, filled with strange scents that reminded him of things he had not smelled since childhood. Cedar smoke, river clay, the particular sweetness of Oklahoma earth after a summer rain. And then he emerged into the chamber. It was vast, so vast that his mind struggled to comprehend it. The ceiling was lost in darkness somewhere far above, and the walls curved away on either side like the interior of some enormous cathedral. Torches burned in brackets along the walls, casting dancing shadows across the stone floor. And in the center of the chamber, surrounded by German soldiers and scientists who were working feverishly at banks of strange equipment, was something that should not have existed. A drum, but not an ordinary drum. This was a drum the size of a house, its surface made of stretched hide that looked ancient beyond measuring. The frame was carved from a single piece of wood, dark and dense, covered with the same symbols that decorated the tunnel walls. And the drum was making sound, not being played, making sound on its own. The vibrations Running Water had been hearing since he entered the forest were coming from this drum. It was humming at a frequency that seemed to exist on the edge of human perception, a continuous tone that resonated in the chest and made the teeth ache. And as Running Water watched, he realized that the German scientists were not studying the drum. They were trying to wake it up. The equipment they had brought down into the chamber was designed to amplify and direct sound. Massive speakers were positioned around the drum, connected by cables to banks of electrical equipment. The scientists were adjusting dials and throwing switches, trying different frequencies, different rhythms. They were searching for something, a code, a key. The same rhythm Running Water's grandfather had taught him. One of the German soldiers spotted him and shouted a warning. Weapons were raised, orders were barked in harsh, clipped German. But before anyone could fire, the drum spoke. Not in sound, in thought. Images flooded Running Water's mind. He saw the beginning of time, when the earth was young, and everything that lived upon it was connected by sound. He saw the first people emerging from underground, taught by beings older than humanity how to listen to the world around them. He saw the knowledge being passed down through generations, preserved in drums and rhythms and pocket watches that contained the echo of creation itself. And he saw what the Germans were trying to do. They had found the drum years ago, buried beneath the Hürtgen forest during an archaeological expedition in 1936. They did not understand what it was, but they recognized its power. The vibrations it produced could be felt for miles. They believed it was some kind of ancient weapon, a device that could generate earthquakes or disrupt enemy communications. They had spent years trying to activate it, to control it, to use it for their war. But the drum was not a weapon, it was a door. And if the Germans succeeded in opening it, something would come through. Running Water understood all of this in the space of a single heartbeat. He understood that his grandfather had known, that his entire lineage, stretching back to the very beginning, had been preparing for this moment. The drum keepers of the Cherokee Nation were not just ceremonial leaders. They were guardians, watchers, protectors of a secret that predated every civilization on Earth. And now it was his turn to protect it. He moved without thinking, drawing his service pistol and firing not at the German soldiers, but at the equipment. Sparks flew, cables snapped, scientists screamed and dove for cover. The soldiers returned fire, bullets whining past Running Water's head, but he was no longer entirely in control of his own body. Something else was guiding him, something that had been waiting thousands of years for this moment. He reached the drum and pressed his grandfather's pocket watch against its surface. The world went silent. Every sound stopped. The gunfire, the screaming, the hum of the equipment, even the breathing of the thing beneath the earth. Everything fell away, leaving only Running Water and the drum, connected by a pocket watch that suddenly felt warm in his hand. And then the drum spoke one final time. "Thank you, grandson. The door will remain closed, but you must carry the truth. You must remember what was almost lost." When sound returned, Running Water was no longer in the chamber. He was lying on the forest floor above, surrounded by the soldiers of his reconnaissance team. The sun was rising on the eastern horizon, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, and the massive opening that had led down into the earth was gone. In its place was simply solid ground, covered with undisturbed snow, as if nothing had ever been there at all. The soldiers stared at him in confusion and fear. They demanded to know what had happened. They said he had stepped toward the opening and then simply vanished, disappearing into thin air for nearly 6 hours. When he reappeared, he was lying in a different location, 50 yards from where they had been waiting. Running Water could not explain. He was not sure he understood himself, but he still had his grandfather's pocket watch, and when he pressed it to his ear, he could hear something new mixed in with the familiar ticking of the mechanism. A heartbeat, slow, deep, patient, waiting. The official report filed by Colonel Patterson made no mention of underground chambers, ancient drums, or Cherokee symbols. It stated simply that the reconnaissance mission had been unsuccessful due to adverse weather conditions and that no German facility had been located in the designated search area. The men who had witnessed Running Water's disappearance were quietly transferred to other units and encouraged to forget what they had seen. Running Water himself was discharged from the army 2 months later, in March of 1945. The official reason was listed as combat fatigue. The unofficial reason was that he had become unreliable, prone to long silences and strange behaviors that made his commanding officers uncomfortable. He returned to Oklahoma in the summer of 1945, just weeks before the war in Europe ended. He went back to Tahlequah, to the house where he had grown up, to the workshop where his grandfather had repaired watches and kept the drums of his people. His grandfather had died while Joseph was overseas. The old man had passed quietly in his sleep on the same night that Joseph descended into the chamber beneath the Hurtgen forest. The timing, Joseph realized, was not a coincidence. Nothing in this story was a coincidence. In his grandfather's workshop, Joseph found a letter waiting for him. The envelope was old, yellowed with age, but it bore his name in his grandfather's careful handwriting. Inside was a single sheet of paper. "Grandson," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then you have heard the drum, you have touched the door, and you have kept it closed. I am proud of you. But your work is not finished. The drum beneath the forest is not the only one. There are others, hidden throughout the world, each one guarded by a people who remember the old ways. The Cherokee are not alone in this responsibility. We are part of a chain that stretches across all nations and all times. You have been given a gift, grandson, the ability to hear what others cannot. Use it wisely. There will be others who seek the drums, others who want to open the doors. You must find them before they succeed. And remember always that you are not alone. The earth speaks to those who know how to listen, and the Creator watches over all who walk in his path. I love you, grandson. I will see you again when the time is right." The letter was signed with his grandfather's name and a symbol that Joseph recognized. the Cherokee word for listen, written in syllabary. Joseph Runningwater spent the rest of his life honoring his grandfather's instructions. He traveled the world, following whispers and rumors to remote locations where other drums might be hidden. He found evidence of similar sites in Peru, in Tibet, in the remote regions of Australia where the Aboriginal people spoke of something called the dream time. He met other guardians, keepers of other traditions, who recognized him as a brother in the ancient work of protection, and he continued to listen. The pocket watch never left his side. He wound it every morning and every night, using the same rhythm his grandfather had taught him. And sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, he heard the heartbeat again, distant, patient, waiting for a time that might never come. Joseph Runningwater died in 1987 at the age of 74. He passed away in his sleep in the same house where his grandfather had died, holding the same pocket watch in his hands. Those who found him said he looked peaceful, content, as if he had finally heard a sound he had been waiting his whole life to hear. But the story does not end with his death. In the decades since Joseph Runningwater passed, there have been reports, strange reports from remote locations around the world. Unexplained vibrations detected by seismographs in places where there should be no geological activity. Ancient sites suddenly becoming focal points for unusual phenomena, and most troubling of all, persistent rumors of well-funded expeditions searching for something called the drums of the Watchers. The organizations behind these expeditions are never clearly identified. They operate through layers of shell companies and anonymous benefactors. But their methods are consistent. They send teams to remote locations with sophisticated sound equipment. They drill into the earth, searching for hollow spaces beneath the surface, and they employ specialists in ancient languages and indigenous traditions, people who might be able to decipher symbols that have been forgotten for millennia. They are looking for the doors. And if you listen carefully, very carefully, in the deep silence of the night, you might hear something that should not be possible. A rhythm coming from far beneath your feet, 3 quick beats, a pause, then 2 slow beats. The rhythm of a heart that is listening, waiting for someone to answer. The watches still exist. The drum beaters are still passed down from generation to generation. And somewhere in the world right now, there are people who know the old ways. People who can hear what others cannot. People who stand between humanity and something vast and patient that has been waiting since before history began. Are they winning? Are they losing? No one knows for certain. But if you find yourself in a quiet place, perhaps in a forest or a field or an ancient site that feels somehow wrong, pay attention to the ground beneath your feet. Put your ear to the earth. Listen with your whole being. And if you hear something tapping back, know that you are not alone. The watchers are still watching. The guardians are still guarding. And the door, for now, remains closed. Some people ask me, after they hear this story, what they should do with this knowledge. They want to know if they should be afraid, if they should prepare for something terrible, if they should believe that there are really ancient drums hidden beneath the earth, waiting for someone foolish enough to try opening them. My answer is always the same. I do not know if every detail of this story is true. I do not know if Joseph Runningwater really heard voices from underground, or if the chamber beneath the Hurtgen forest actually existed. History is full of mysteries, and the human mind is capable of experiencing things that cannot be easily explained. But I do know this. There is a power in listening. There is a wisdom in paying attention to the world around us, to the quiet voices that speak beneath the noise of modern life. Our ancestors understood this. They built their lives around the rhythms of the earth, the cycles of the seasons, the heartbeat of creation itself. Somewhere along the way, we forgot how to listen. We filled our world with noise and distraction, drowning out the whispers that might have guided us towards something greater. Joseph Runningwater never forgot. He carried his grandfather's teachings through a world war and beyond, using his gift to protect people who never knew they were in danger. He did not seek fame or recognition. He simply did what needed to be done, one heartbeat at a time. Perhaps that is the real lesson of this story. Not that there are drums beneath the earth or doors that should never be opened, but that each of us carries within us the ability to hear what truly matters, if only we take the time to listen. In these dark and confusing times, when it seems like the world is spinning out of control, I encourage you to find your own pocket watch, find your own rhythm, find the thing that connects you to something larger than yourself, whether that is family, tradition, faith, or simply the quiet voice of your own conscience. And most importantly, I encourage you to seek the light that never fails. The God who created the earth and everything in it is still speaking to those who listen. His Son, Jesus Christ, walked this world and showed us the path to eternal life. In him there is no darkness too deep, no door too terrible, no enemy too powerful. The watchers may guard the drums of the earth, but the Creator guards something far more precious, your soul. Turn to him. Listen to his voice, and you will find a peace that no darkness can ever destroy. Until next time, my friends, keep listening, keep believing, and remember that you are never, ever alone. The heartbeat continues, and so does the story. What happened in that forest in 1945 was real. The soldiers who witnessed it never spoke publicly, but their families passed down whispered accounts that persist to this day. If you search through military archives with enough patience, you will find documents that reference unexplained phenomena in the Hurtgen forest during the winter offensive. Pages that have been redacted, reports that were filed and then lost. Someone does not want this story to be known, but the earth remembers. The drums remember, and Joseph Runningwater's pocket watch, wherever it is now, still keeps perfect time. 3 quick beats, a pause, 2 slow beats, the rhythm of a heart that is listening. Are you